Imagine a man who ran toward danger while the rest of the world ran away. A man who would dive into murky water to wrestle a 300-pound crocodile. Not for money, not for fame, not for adrenaline, but because he loved that animal with every fiber of his being. Imagine a man who made billions of people around the world look at snakes and sharks and spiders and think for the very first time, that is beautiful. How does one person do that? How does one man reach into the hearts of an entire planet and change the way humanity sees the natural world? This is not just the story of a television star. This is the story of a boy who grew up in the wild, who turned his whole life into a mission, who loved animals more than he feared death, and who left the world forever changed because of it. This is the story of Steve Irwin.
On February 22nd, 1962, in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, a boy was born who would one day become the most famous wildlife warrior on the planet. His name was Stephen Robert Irwin, but the world would come to know him simply as Steve. His parents, Bob and Lynn Irwin, were unlike most families on the street. Bob was a passionate wildlife enthusiast and a plumber by trade, and Lynn was a nurse with a deep love for native animals. Together, they didn't just talk about loving nature, they lived it. Their home was always filled with creatures: rescued kangaroos, injured birds, lost reptiles. For most children, a pet is a dog or a cat. For Steve, animals were simply family. When Steve was 8 years old, his parents made a decision that would shape the entire course of his life. They packed up and moved the family to Beerwah in Queensland, a sun-scorched stretch of land north of Brisbane. And there, on the edge of the wild, Bob and Lynn Irwin opened a small sanctuary for native reptiles. They called it the Beerwah Reptile and Fauna Park. It was modest. It was dusty. It was not glamorous. But for young Steve Irwin, it was paradise. He didn't grow up watching cartoons on Saturday mornings. He grew up feeding pythons before breakfast. He grew up learning the difference between a venomous eastern brown snake and a harmless tree snake before most children had learned to ride a bicycle. This was not just his home. This was his classroom, his playground, and his calling, all wrapped into one extraordinary place. By the time Steve was 6 years old, he was already handling small reptiles under his father's watchful eye. By 9, he was wrestling his first crocodile. Let that sink in for a moment. 9 years old. While other boys his age were kicking footballs and trading cards, Steve Irwin was learning the weight and strength of a living dinosaur. He wasn't reckless. He was connected. He felt things that most people never feel when they look at an animal: a deep instinctive understanding, a respect, and an overwhelming sense of love. His friends thought he was crazy. His neighbors thought he was unusual. But his father saw something extraordinary in his son, a gift that couldn't be taught in any school, only lived. Steve didn't fear snakes. He didn't fear spiders. He didn't even fear the crocodile, an animal that had roamed this earth for over 200 million years and could crush bone in its jaws. He feared something else entirely. He feared a world where these animals were misunderstood, hated, and destroyed. And that fear would fuel him for the rest of his life. Steve's education looked nothing like what you'd find in a textbook. He went to school, yes, but the lessons that shaped him came from the bush, from the swamps, from his father's steady hands guiding his own. Bob Irwin was not just a parent. He was a mentor, a teacher, and a living encyclopedia of Australian wildlife. Every day in the park was a lesson. Every animal encounter was a lecture that no university could ever replicate. Steve learned to read the body language of a frightened python. He learned to approach a cassowary without triggering its aggression. He learned that crocodiles are not monsters. They are ancient, intelligent, deeply misunderstood creatures that have more right to this earth than almost anything else alive. He absorbed everything. He never stopped learning, never stopped asking questions, never stopped pushing himself deeper into the wild world he loved. Because for Steve, learning wasn't a phase of life. It was life itself. As Steve grew into a young man, the family's little reptile park grew too. But it was always a struggle. Money was tight. Resources were limited. Running a wildlife sanctuary is not a profitable business. It is a labor of love, built on sacrifice and stubbornness and sheer passion. When Steve took over the running of the park in his 20s, it was still a humble operation. But he had a vision that burned brighter than the Queensland sun. He didn't want a zoo. He wanted a sanctuary, a place where every animal was respected, where conservation was the heartbeat of every decision, where visitors didn't just look at animals, but truly understood them. He worked relentlessly, sunrise to sunset and beyond, fixing fences, feeding animals, educating visitors, fundraising, fighting. He gave everything he had to the place that had given everything to him. And slowly, year by year, the park began to grow. The Beerwah Reptile and Fauna Park became the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park. And eventually, it would become Australia Zoo, one of the most famous wildlife parks on the face of the earth. But none of that happened quickly, and none of it happened easily. Behind every smiling photo, behind every jubilant "crikey," there were years of grinding, unglamorous, backbreaking work. Long before the television cameras found him, Steve Irwin was already doing the most important work of his life. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Steve became deeply involved in crocodile rescue operations across Queensland. At this time, saltwater crocodiles, magnificent, ancient creatures, were being killed at an alarming rate. They were wandering into farms, threatening livestock, coming too close to human communities. The automatic response was simple and brutal. Shoot them. Steve refused to accept that. He began venturing deep into the wild, into rivers, into swamps, into places that made trained rangers uncomfortable, to capture these crocodiles alive and relocate them to safer territory. This was not a safe job. This was not a job with health insurance and a comfortable office. This was a man, alone or with a small crew, in the pitch black of a Queensland night, sliding into the water after a 12-foot saltwater crocodile. He was bitten. He was thrashed. He was dragged. He came close to death more times than he could count. But every crocodile he captured alive was a crocodile that didn't die. And that, to Steve, was worth every bruise, every scar, every terrifying moment in the dark water. This work, quiet, unphotographed, unrecognized, was the foundation of everything Steve Irwin stood for. Not the fame, not the catchphrase. This. The actual, physical, dangerous, daily act of saving lives. Animal lives that most of the world didn't care about at all. In 1991, a young American woman named Terri arrived at the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park. She had come to visit. She stayed for a lifetime. Terri was from Eugene, Oregon. She had grown up with a love for animals, too, running her own wildlife rehabilitation program back home. When she walked into Steve's world and saw this loud, warm, passionate, sun-baked Australian man wrestling crocodiles with pure joy on his face, something clicked. They fell in love fast and completely. Just 4 months after they met, Steve Irwin and Terri were married. It was June 4th, 1992. And their honeymoon was not a beach resort or a European city. It was a crocodile trapping expedition in the Australian bush. Terri was right there beside him, holding equipment, filming on a handheld camera, laughing and gasping as her brand-new husband threw himself into the water after massive crocodiles. That footage, raw, shaky, astonishing, became the pilot episode of a television show that would change everything. They called it The Crocodile Hunter. When The Crocodile Hunter first aired, nobody quite knew what to make of it. Here was this big, enthusiastic Australian man in khaki shorts running headlong into situations that made trained professionals nervous, narrating everything in real time with a joy so infectious it felt almost unreal. He wasn't performing for the camera. He wasn't reading from a script. He was just being Steve, and the world couldn't look away. The show exploded. It was picked up by Discovery Channel and Animal Planet and beamed into households across America, Europe, Asia, and beyond. Suddenly, Steve Irwin was everywhere. His energy was unlike anything television had ever seen. He wasn't presenting wildlife as something distant and exotic to be observed from a safe distance. He was in it, mud-covered, breathless, passionate, laughing in the face of danger, and making you feel every single moment alongside him. And then there was the catchphrase. Crikey! 2 syllables, 1 word, heard in every language, in every country, by every age. A word that became synonymous with wonder, with adventure, with that feeling of seeing the natural world and being completely, utterly, gloriously overwhelmed by it. Children adored him. Scientists respected him. Grandmothers watched him in their living rooms and felt a thrill they hadn't felt in decades. Steve Irwin didn't just make wildlife television. He made wildlife matter. But Steve was never, ever just a television personality. Every dollar earned from The Crocodile Hunter, from merchandise, from the show, from Australia Zoo, was channeled back into conservation. Steve and Terri established the Steve Irwin Conservation Foundation, later known as Wildlife Warriors. They funded anti-poaching operations. They supported marine research. They campaigned fiercely against the destruction of natural habitats. And then, Steve did something that very few celebrities in history have ever done. He spent millions of his own money buying land. Not beach houses, not luxury properties. Wildlife corridors. Stretches of bush and rainforest and wetland in Australia, Vanuatu, Fiji, and beyond. Purchased and protected so that animals would always have somewhere safe to live. At the time of his death, Steve Irwin had helped protect over 1,700 acres of critical wildlife habitat. He didn't do it for headlines. He did it because he genuinely, deeply, absolutely believed that humans had a responsibility to share this planet with the creatures they shared it with. That belief wasn't a talking point. It was the engine of his entire existence.
For all his wildness, for all his fearlessness, Steve Irwin was, at his core, a family man. He and Terri built something rare and beautiful together, a partnership of equals, a love story rooted in the same values, the same passion, the same unshakable belief that the natural world was worth fighting for. In 1998, their daughter Bindi Sue Irwin was born, named after one of Steve's favorite crocodiles. And in 2003, their son Robert Clarence Irwin arrived. Steve was transformed by fatherhood. This enormous, fearless man who wrestled crocodiles for a living would sit for hours with his children, talking to them about animals, about nature, about why it all mattered. He raised them the same way he had been raised, not in front of screens, but in the bush. Not reading about nature, but touching it, breathing it, becoming a part of it. He loved his family with the same intensity with which he loved everything else, fully, loudly, without holding back.
Fame, of course, comes with a shadow. Not everyone saw Steve Irwin the way his fans did. There were critics who believed his methods were reckless, that getting so close to dangerous animals was irresponsible, that it sent the wrong message, that it put both animals and people at risk. Wildlife experts occasionally raised concerns. Some accused him of disturbing animals for entertainment. And then, in 2004, a photograph emerged that sent the media into a frenzy. Steve was holding 1-month-old Robert in one arm while feeding a crocodile with the other. The outrage was swift and global. Headlines screamed. Commentators condemned. It was compared to other infamous incidents of celebrity recklessness. Steve was devastated by the reaction, not because he feared the criticism, but because he knew in his heart that he had been teaching his son the same way his father had taught him, the same way he had learned everything he knew. He acknowledged the perception. He apologized for the alarm it caused. But those who knew him understood the truth. That child was never in danger, and that moment was never about spectacle. It was about a father sharing the most important thing in his world with his son. The criticism stung, but it did not stop him. Nothing ever stopped Steve Irwin.
What made Steve Irwin different from every other wildlife presenter, every other conservationist, every other public figure who spoke about nature? It wasn't knowledge. Plenty of people know about animals. It wasn't bravery. Plenty of people are brave. It was something rarer, something harder to name. It was love. Steve Irwin loved animals the way most people love their closest friends. He felt their pain. He celebrated their strength. He mourned them when they died. He was not performing empathy for a camera. He was living it, bleeding it, breathing it every single day. And that love was contagious. You cannot watch Steve Irwin hold a snake and not feel, even for a moment, that the snake is extraordinary. You cannot watch him with a crocodile and not feel the ancient power and beauty of that animal. He didn't tell you to care. He just cared so much, so openly, so genuinely, that caring became the only rational response. He was also, beneath the exuberance, a deeply humble man. Money did not interest him. Status did not interest him. What mattered was the mission. Always the mission. By 2006,
Steve Irwin was 44 years old and showing no signs of slowing down. He was working on a new documentary series, this time exploring the ocean. The deep blue world beneath the waves had always fascinated him, and now he was diving into it with the same wholehearted passion he brought to everything. Sharks, rays, marine life of every kind. He was in the water more than ever. He was busier than ever. He was as alive as he had ever been. In September of 2006, Steve was filming near Bat Reef, just off the coast of Port Douglas in Queensland. The water was clear. The day was bright. He was snorkeling, filming underwater footage of the extraordinary marine life beneath him. And then, in a moment that shocked the world, everything changed. On September 4th, 2006, Steve Irwin was struck in the chest by the barb of a short-tail stingray. It was, in every sense, a freak accident. Stingrays are not aggressive animals. They are docile, gentle creatures that pose almost no threat to humans. What happened that day was an extraordinary and tragic collision. The ray's barb penetrated Steve's heart. He died within minutes, in the water he loved, doing the work he lived for. He was 44 years old. The news spread across the planet within hours, and the reaction was unlike anything the world had seen for the loss of a wildlife presenter, a television host, an environmentalist. World leaders offered condolences. Millions of people wept openly. Children who had grown up watching the Crocodile Hunter couldn't comprehend a world in which he no longer existed. Australia mourned as if it had lost a son, because it had. The Australian government offered a state funeral. Terri, true to the man Steve was, declined. Instead, a private memorial was held at Australia's zoo, attended by family, friends, and staff who had loved him up close, not from a television screen. The world stood still for a moment, and then, slowly, it turned, carrying the weight of his absence and the light of his legacy. Steve Irwin has been gone for nearly 2 decades, and yet he is everywhere. Australia Zoo continues to thrive under Terri's leadership. It has grown into one of the finest wildlife conservation centers on the planet. Bindi Irwin, that little girl named after a crocodile, grew up to become a passionate conservationist and public advocate for wildlife, just as her father was. Robert Irwin has become a gifted wildlife photographer and presenter, carrying his father's spirit into a new generation with a warmth and joy that is unmistakably inherited. The Wildlife Warriors Foundation continues to operate, funding conservation projects around the world. The land Steve purchased is still protected. The crocodiles he rescued still swim in rivers across Queensland. The species he fought for are still here, in part because he fought for them. So what do we take from the life of Steve Irwin? We take the lesson that passion is not a hobby. It is a calling. And when you find yours, when you feel it in your chest the way Steve felt it every time he looked at a wild animal, you must pursue it without apology, without hesitation, without waiting for the world's permission. We take the lesson that fear and bravery are not opposites. Steve was not fearless because he felt no fear. He was fearless because love was always louder. We take the lesson that the natural world is not a backdrop to human life. It is the foundation of it. And protecting it is not an option. It is a responsibility that every one of us carries, whether we have a television show or not. We take the lesson that a life lived in full color, loud, passionate, joyful, devoted, is always too short. But the mark it leaves can last forever. And perhaps most importantly, we take this. You do not need to be perfect to change the world. You do not need to be polished or politically careful or universally approved of. You just need to care. Genuinely.
Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a man in khaki shorts standing at the edge of a river as the sun rises over Queensland. The water is dark. Something moves beneath the surface. Enormous, ancient, misunderstood. Something the world has been taught to fear. And this man smiles. Not because he is reckless, not because he doesn't understand the danger, but because he sees what others cannot see. He sees a creature of extraordinary beauty. He sees 400 million years of survival. He sees something worth protecting, worth celebrating, worth diving into the dark water for. He sees what we all could see, if only someone showed us how to look. Steve Irwin showed us how to look. He ran headlong into the wild, arms wide open, heart wide open. And he grabbed this beautiful, dangerous, magnificent world with both hands. And he held it up to the light and said, "Look. Look at this. Isn't it incredible?"